They are shadows in the night, the whispers of terror, renegades and bringers of fear. They are the Night Lords, and now you can learn their deepest painting secrets. A huge thanks to Games Workshop for sending me the new Kill Team Nightmare box early to create some content for you. Make sure you leave the lights on for this one. Let's get painting. The Night Lords have a characteristic dark blue armour, so to get started I've sprayed this Night Lord with Tempest Blue spray from Colourforge. Now, if you can't get Colourforge where you are, it's a direct match for Kantor Blue, so all you need to do is either use an airbrush with Kantor Blue or prime it black and then paint it Kantor Blue. There is a lot of trim on these Chaos models and there's no getting away from that, unfortunately. So I'm now going to take some Balthasar Gold and paint all of the trim that colour. Now, you may need 2 coats in some places because it's going over this darker colour, but just take your time and try not to spill it. With that Balthasar Gold down, we'll now paint all of the silver, and the colour I'm using is dark aluminium from Vallejo Metal Colour. The reason I'm basing all the silver now and also the red is because we're going to wash everything at the same time. And again, when we're putting these colours down, it's best to be as careful as we can be. We can, of course, clean them up later on, but the less mistakes we make, the quicker it'll be to paint. I'm now going to base all of the red elements using Khorne Red. So this is things like the winged icon, any tabards that you want to be a darker red colour, and also any straps. I'm now going to wash the entire model using Nuln Oil. Now, you may see me use different Night Lord models for this video, but unfortunately I was only able to finish one, which is the leader. So regardless of the model I'm painting in this video, I'm doing them all the same, but I'm going to focus on the leader as we go forward. When that Nuln Oil is completely dry, it's time to start highlighting. And the colour I'm going to use for this is Runelord Brass. So I'm not being too careful with this. I'm just making sure I don't paint it into any recesses. But I am generally looking for those parts of the trim and the armour that catch the most light. And I'm just going to drag my brush along those areas. To make that brass pop even more, I'm going to give it a final highlight with Canoptek Alloy. Now, generally with this colour, I'm looking to just edge highlight. So I'm looking to drag my brush along sharp edges, and this gives me a nice, crisp, clean line. Try not to go overboard with this, but if you do, don't worry, you can always glaze back in with some of the darker colours just to ease that transition. For all of the silver, I'm going to highlight this with Chrome from Vallejo Model Air. And while I'm doing this, it's important to take a moment of reflection because I have just used the last of my Chrome Model Air. This bottle has been with me since before the start of the channel, so it's been on a journey. But it's now empty, time for a new one. I'm going to paint all the black elements next, and the colour I'm going to use this is AK Black. You can use whatever black you prefer. I'm looking to paint things like tubes on the helmet and the chest piece, and also any of the rubber undersuit which is showing through. Now, you will need to be careful at this stage to make sure you don't accidentally paint something you've already finished. I'm going to highlight that black using Mechanicus Standard Grey. Now, this is a very subtle highlight. You don't need to use too much because there's not really that much black on the model. So just make sure you've got a good tip on your brush. Where you can, drag it along the sculpt, and where you can't, just be very, very careful. While I've got that Mechanicus Grey on the palette, I'm going to paint all of the elements that are going to be the Flayed Flesh on the Night Lords. And the reason for this is because it's going to make it a lot easier to apply a flesh base tone later on. And it'll show through a little bit, giving a grey pallid tone to some of that flesh. I'm going to base the leather next, and the colour I'm going to use that is Dryad Bark, which is a nice desaturated brown colour. So again, there's not a huge amount on the model, just take your time in terms of applying it across the piece. I did miss a red strap, so I've painted that with Khorne Red, and I'm now going to wash that and all of the leather using Nuln Oil. Now, this is a nice, easy step, very similar to the one we did before. We just want to make sure that we're not letting it pool too heavily in any of the recesses. We can then highlight all of the leather very easily, firstly using Dryad Bark, and what we're looking to do is drag this along the sharp edges that we can see. This does give us a nice, crisp highlight. Don't worry if this is a little bit too thick. We'll then refine that further using some Gorthor Brown, which is, again, it's a nice, lighter, desaturated brown. And this is where we don't want too much on our brush. We're just going to use the tip. We're going to drag it along those sharp edges. And this gives us a nice, crisp, lighter highlight inside that previous highlight of Dryad Bark. Going to start highlighting all of the red elements next, firstly with Khorne Red. So we're just going to catch everything, leaving the darker colours in the recesses. Now, take your time with this because we are starting to work with parts of the model that we've already finished. Next up, we're going to punch up the contrast using Evil Sunz Scarlet. So with the Evil Sunz Scarlet, we're looking to drag this along the sharp raised details. This is a nice vibrant red, which will give you a really, really nice highlight. The final highlight on the red is going to be with Wild Rider Red. Now, we don't want too much of this, so very little on our brush, and we're going to drag this along only the sharpest edges and the parts that are going to catch the most light. So this is where the red can start to tip towards orange, and that's why we don't want to use too much of it. We just want to put enough on there so it catches nicely and you can make out that it's a nice vibrant red. On to all of the Flayed Flesh next. Now this is going to be a little bit of an experimentation in terms of how I do this. There's no hard and fast rules, but the first thing I'm doing is basing it all using Bugman's Glow. Now I've thinned this down with a little bit of water, so get a first coat on, let it dry, and you'll start to see some of that grey showing through, which gives you a nice pallid hue to some of the colour. So once we've got that down, we'll start to think about how we maybe segment out some of the different skin patches so that we can get a little bit of variation on there. The first thing I'm going to do is take some Cadian Fleshtone and pick out a couple of areas that I want to be slightly lighter and paint them in, covering all of them, but I'm not too concerned about how opaque this layer is. And so at this point I did start to regret gluing the cloak and the backpack to the model, which I referenced in my review video, which you can find on my Patreon using the link in the description. Now you don't have to sign up for a paid account to see that on Patreon. It's free for everyone, so you can join as a free user. While the Cadian Fleshtone was wet, I just added a little bit of Bugman's Glow back into the recesses to wet blend it slightly. Then I decided I wanted some darker flesh, so I based that using Blood Reaver Flesh. With this one, I did build up more of an opaque layer. I highlighted this using some Night Questor Flesh. Now this isn't actually too far away from Bugman's Glow, so if you haven't got this colour, you can mix some brown into Bugman's Glow, or you can mix some Bugman's Glow into the Blood Reaver Flesh to get this highlight. I moved back to the lighter flesh next and started to highlight some of the raised areas using Kislev Flesh. Now this is a nice, easy, straightforward, and you can see as I'm applying the paint, I'm not applying it in thin layers. I'm kind of doing it in a stippling, dragging the brush, because again, this is dead flesh, so we just want to make sure that it's not smooth. It looks a little bit mottled in some areas. And I also use this Kislev Flesh to base some of the areas that are going to be the absolute lightest. With these base tones down, I wanted to add a little bit more definition. So the first thing I did was take some Agrax Earthshade and wash this over the area of the darkest flesh that I've got on there. Now, it's important here that it doesn't settle too heavily in the recesses, so I didn't put too much Agrax Earthshade on. I just wanted it to help blend those colours and add a little bit more definition in the recesses. Similarly, I did the same with Reikland Fleshshade on all of the brightest skin parts. Now, as this is torn flayed flesh, it's important to get some red elements into it where you can see damage and blood spatter. So I use some Berserker Bloodshade. Now the first thing I did was focus on where all the flesh has been stitched together, because that's the end of the flesh, that's where all the torn flesh is. And then I started to stipple the Berserker Bloodshade around all of the edges, because again, this is where it's been cut away. So it's not like it's going to end smoothly. This is going to be where there's been some savage chopping going on. So I'm just stippling this Berserker Bloodshade all around these areas. Now, if you do find that you put too much on, that's not a problem. It's really easy to fix. You can just stipple over it using the base colour that you've gone over. So either Cadian Fleshtone, Bugman's Glow, or some of that Blood Reaver Flesh. Next up, I painted the bone. So the first thing I did was base all of it using Zandri Dust. Now, as I've been painting along, I've been painting the bone at the same time with the flesh colours, because again, that's just going to make it really easy to cover in one coat with Zandri Dust. Just be careful you don't clog any detail. I'm then going to add some definition by washing all of the bones using Agrax Earthshade. And I'm then going to highlight all the bones using Screamin Skull. It's really important that you let the Agrax Earthshade dry properly before you do this. The reason I've gone for Screamin Skull is it's much brighter. Sharpty bone doesn't really give me much of a jump. You can always mix a little Zandri and Screamin Skull if you need to blend that a little bit. I then carefully painted all of the staples using dark aluminium. So it's really important that you take your time with this and just drag your brush over the sculpted detail and make sure you haven't got too much paint on your brush either. Now it's time for the plasma glow and the eyes. So the first thing I did was paint the plasma coils and the eyes and actually the skulls on the wing icons with Corax White. Now I did need 2 coats to cover, but that's perfectly fine. Just make sure you've got a nice even coverage. I then highlighted the plasma coil using bold titanium white from ProCrill. You can use whatever bright white you've got and that you prefer to use. In terms of the areas I focus on is just dragging it across the top and along the sides of the plasma coil. For the white elements on the skulls, it's just highlighting them like you would any normal skull. I also put a dot in the eye socket, being careful not to spill this onto any of the metal around it. To paint the plasma glow is really easy. Take your contrast colour of choice. I've gone for Magmadroth Flame because I wanted an orange one. And paint this all over the plasma coils. Before it dries, clean your brush off and drag it along the highest point. And this will take away some of that contrast paint, giving you an inbuilt highlight, which doesn't look too stark. For the eyes, I used Baal Red contrast paint and did exactly the same. I painted it into the socket, cleaned my brush off, and then took away some of that contrast paint to give me a little bit of a glow in the eyes. We're on the home stretch with just the armour and lightning left to go. So if you haven't already, tidy up the armour using Kantor Blue to make sure that you haven't got any mistakes on display. I'm then going to take a 50-50 mix of Kantor Blue and Caledor Sky and put a nice thick edge highlight all over it. And I'm also going to focus on areas that are going to catch the most light. So I'm actually going to paint quite a bit of the armour with this mix, and that's going to start to push some of the elements to the brighter blue, which is going to really help us make it stand out. The next highlight is going to be with pure Caledor Sky. And again, I'm focusing on kind of area highlights with this. So I'm thinking about some of the volumes. So we've got circular highlights on the shoulder pads, for example. We've got a cylindrical highlight down some of the legs. And I'm really enjoying applying this because it's starting to boost the contrast on the armour quite nicely. Now, if you're not sure how to do this, you can just follow the video. Or if you want to just stick to edge highlighting, you can do that as well. The first proper edge highlight is going to be with Teclis Blue. So we're looking to make this a little bit more refined. So we're going to drag this along any sharp elements to make sure we've got a nice crisp highlight. Where we can't drag it, we're just going to use the tip of the brush to paint this inside the armour around some of the trim. So again, it just helps it stand out. And because we've got a nice transition of colours underneath, it starts to pop quite quickly and look quite nice. The extreme highlight we'll do is with Northern Blue. Now, we don't want to use too much Northern Blue. We just want to tap this across the mini where we're going to get those brightest highlights. So particularly where we've got some angular elements and also parts that are going to catch the most lights. There's quite a few around the model. Just work your way around. If you're not sure, you can check the box art. On to the lightning then. So the first thing we're going to do is take some Sotek Green and we're going to paint some jagged lines where we want the lightning to be. So I'm going to do some on the knee pad and some of the greaves, the vambraces, and also that blank shoulder pad. I'm then going to paint some Temple Guard Blue inside that Sotek Green from the next step. Now, all of this has been done with a very sharp point on my brush, making sure that my lines are very, very thin. If you need to go back and start again, you certainly can do using the base colours that you've already used. And it's really appropriate to go in and make sure that you haven't got too much lightning going on because that'll just make it all look like a bit of a mess. We'll then move on to Baharroth Blue, and this is a very stark blue colour that's really going to stand out quite nicely. And we're going to use this to really drive home those lightning effects. Again, we're only using the tip of the brush and we're making sure that we're painting inside the previous lines. Finally, to finish off, we're going to take some bold titanium white and dot this where those lines crisscross each other because that's where the lightning is going to be sparking. This is a really nice and easy technique to get some great looking lightning really quickly. You can also practice this as much as you want on some of the spare parts in the kit. So there we have it. That wasn't so scary after all, was it? This Night Lord is done, ready for the tabletop. I just need to finish the rest of the kill team now. The brass trim always puts me off the Chaos models, but I'm really happy with how this has turned out. So if I can get all 10 looking like this, I'll be really, really happy. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like and a comment down below. And if you enjoy my content, please consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next one.